Thank you again for joining us. It's time for our second speakers. You'll know them as the production team behind documentaries including From Bedrooms to Billions. Their current in development documentary, Rubber Wonder for the ZX Spectrum, and also currently just funded on Kickstarter, I understand in the last 24 hours, is a new documentary on the Amiga 500. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speakers today, Nicola and Anthony Caulfield.
Hello there.
Hello.
Thank you very much. A very nice room. This actually, nice and airy, isn't it? So we came here last year, and it was I think we're in the tent downstairs, and it was all very strange because the pandemic was still on and everything. So it's really nice to actually come to an event and it feel a little bit more sort of back to normal again and everything. So we're just going to start by having a little bit of a chat about what we've been doing since we were last here in August last year. We've funded a film on the ZX Spectrum in October last year, a 40th anniversary sort of special, and it's we started a physical production of that in around unfortunately we had COVID in January, but we sort of started it properly in February, and we really sort of wanted to sort of look at how the impact that the ZX Spectrum had when we were making the original From Bedrooms to Billions film. Obviously the Commodore 64 came up and some other computers, but the ZX Spectrum came up continually. And what we were quite surprised about was that when people sort of say, oh, it sparked the UK games industry, it did, because it obviously it was at a price which, even though by today's standards would be still over £400, that price of £125 back in 1982 brought home computing it made it available for the masses. And that's we wanted to explore how that actually happened, how they were able to get the price to be so cheap, because compared with other computers at the time, they were way more expensive. So we decided, okay, well obviously Sir Clive Sinclair had passed away in September last year, and that kind of was the reason why we decided that we wanted to explore the Spectrum. We've been working for quite some time on a Commodore 64 film, on and off, and it had gradually been coming together. We put that sort of on hold for a little while and decided to focus very much on the Spectrum. So we funded the film last year, we started production in February, and we started reaching out to the original engineers, as many of the original Sinclair development team. Obviously Rick Dickinson, who designed the physical design of the ZX Spectrum and ZX81, passed away a few years ago, but he actually designed the Spectrum next, but his design partner Phil Candy was available to talk to us. We started getting real movement in February. So one of the first interviews we actually shot was with Richard Altwasser, who was the PCB designer of the Spectrum, and he told us from his point of view that he'd worked on the ZX81, and that Sir Clive Sinclair had tasked him and Dr. Steve Vickers, the co-designer of the hardware of the Spectrum. Well, actually designed the ROM, but that's no small thing. That effectively Sir Clive looked at it and said, we just want a colour ZX81, that's it. And what surprised us initially was that actually people will say that Clive Sinclair hated games and didn't want games on the Spectrum. That's not actually true. One thing about Sir Clive we've discovered is that he was a great entrepreneur. And while obviously the C5 and certain other things like the QL, we perhaps feel unfairly that's continually brought up, whereas in reality he was an inventor. That's what he was, and he's like any good inventor. Once they've invented something and it's out, they kind of lose a bit of interest and they want to do the next big thing, and that was what really happened. For Clive, the computer was after the ZX80, which was kind of a proof of concept. The ZX81 was really the machine that he considered the innovation of actually having a very cheap computer out there, and it sold really well. We were surprised how many millions of units the ZX81 sold across the world. I will shut up in a minute and play something, but I don't think you need to speak in a minute.
Never get an idea.
So we were surprised that when Richard said to us, it was the Spectrum project was almost like just do a colour ZX81. But when they then approached the design and looked at it and thought, in order to do colour, we're going to have to make some other changes and everything. So I'll actually show you a little clip from Richard Altwasser talking about designing the PCB of the ZX Spectrum. And I forgot my glasses, so this is like, this is genuinely like looking through Vaseline. There we go.
So one of the reasons that we decided to have high-resolution pixels and lower-resolution colour was based on the way the human eye works. So, human vision can result in much finer detail, brightness, luminance, if you like, than we can resolve colour. And the PAL TV system took advantage of that, so that the bandwidth of the luminance signal was 3 or 4 times greater than the bandwidth of the chrominance signal. And we also knew at that time that the Oracle and CFAX teletext standards also followed a similar pattern. They set colour per character, but of course you could address individual pixels. So that was, if you like, the background and the reasoning behind choosing high-resolution pixels but lower-resolution colour. Now, was this a compromise? Yes, of course it's a compromise. Was it a controversial compromise? Well, people today, 40 years later, are still debating, was this the right decision? We've got the colour clash. Why did you do that? So why did we make that compromise? We had to meet a price point. We could have gone for hardware's price. The chips were available. We could have put special chips and additional memory in so that we could have multicoloured sprites moving invisibly across a background without any degradation of colour. We could have gone for something that approximates to much later computer standards where every single pixel on the screen has its own colour palette. But again, think of the additional memory that's needed. Think of the additional chips that would be needed for all the address mapping, all of the video buffering. Again, we needed to meet a price point. So that was the compromise.
I think something that's been quite interesting through all the interviews that we've been doing is I didn't realise that Clive Sinclair started off writing in magazines way back in the 60s, working on ants. I didn't realise all of this. I don't think you did either, did you? It's and it's been really lovely interviewing everyone because we've got quite a good lineup of interviews now. And the history they've been giving us about Clive Sinclair. And I think, certainly when I was growing up, it was all about, the C5's come out and he's this madcap inventor and everything. But just listening to all these lovely little stories about him and how focused he was, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? So the film, whilst it's obviously going to tell us all about the Spectrum and all about everything that he created, I think we're going to show a lot more about him, but certainly I've not heard a lot of this before.
No, we were very lucky we've also got Christopher Curry, who's the co-founder of Acorn, which, if you didn't know, he worked with Clive Sinclair for over 10 years and worked on the executive calculator and other innovations, and also the MK14, which was Sinclair's first real sort of foray into any form of programmable computer. So we sort of, and we've got a clip of Chris.
Chris tells quite a funny story about where he was at a party, because apparently Clive was very legendary parties that he threw, didn't he? And he got very drunk at this party, and then he had to go off for a meeting to get this chip for the calculator, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
We could show it near the end actually, because he basically was. What was interesting about the early 1970s as well was we had the development of the microprocessor. So suddenly, you could then take the concept of having a very large computer stored in an air-conditioned raised floor room and start to actually look at how this could become a real thing, because home computers was something which in the 70s there was engineers aspiring to be able to create that, and there was also a flourishing kit community in the mid-70s that were trying to create kit computers and other sort of programmable things. But the funny thing is, the next clip we're going to show you is, as well as having an actual PCB, a piece of technology, you also need to think about how it's housed, how it's actually going to be displayed. So it's appealing, because you want to sell it. You don't want something that necessarily looks like a house brick or made out of wood. You want something that perhaps is appealing. So we've got a clip here to show you from industrial designer Phil Candy, who worked with Phil Dickinson, the visual,
Rick Dickinson.
sorry, did I say Phil?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's been a long day. Worked very closely with Rick Dickinson for more than 25 years.
Well, I think something that was quite nice about the day that we filmed Phil was that he came along with a box full of all of Rick Dickinson's old sketches, and they were amazing. To us, it was like, oh my god, this is amazing. It's like being kids in the sweet shop, wasn't it?
Was it opening the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
There was just so much of it, so we are going to arrange to go and photograph all of these, so there's a bit more of a permanent record and that, and hopefully get some of that into the film.
Yes, and we'll show you a little bit of Phil Candy now, talking about the considerations that an industrial designer has when they're actually trying to obviously put a piece of technology into something that looks visually appealing. Now again, I've got the blurred eyes again, so there we go, Phil Candy. There we go.
The difficulty with industrial design is not the turnkey elements. So we'll start off with the usability of the product, the components, the placement, the GA, manufacturability, serviceability, all of those things. Those are pretty much a given that it's going to be built at the right price and all that sort of stuff. The difficulty is creating something that has an X factor. That is to say, is more than the sum of its parts. Apple are great at this. You know, you want to touch it. You don't even know what it does, and you want to pick it up. You want to. It's so tactile that you want to handle it. It's got cold metal parts. It's got shiny plastic parts. Those are the qualities that we're looking for, and it's not at all easy to do. Rick was very good at it. The beauty of these products, the ZX81 with this membrane keyboard, is that it looks nice, but it's actually a very cheap product. This is what allowed the product to sell in such high numbers, is its low cost. But the price paid for the low cost here is that you've got no tactile response on those keys. So it was obviously decided for the next iteration, the colour one, that we need to up our game slightly and get some tactile feedback. And that tactile feedback comes in the form of an elastomeric or a rubber keyboard. We'll call it rubber, shall we, if not. And then you've got that popping, that tactile feedback, and you can tune it to get the right feed to it. But it's still made at a cost. The cost is the driver for both of these products, and that's the key to it. And once they're established, groundbreaking, right price products, they can then think about going for a better, higher quality product and have molded keys, which is of course what they did.
Those were some of Rick's sketches in there.
And we've got, I think so obviously the visual design is obviously important to make it appealing. We all used to, well, not all of us, but jokes were made about the keys, and exactly as Phil says there, that was actually a design consideration. It was fascinating when we were looking at Rick's sketches, how he was coming to the design of those particular keys, and how even the mechanism with which they press down onto the membrane and everything. You could see the sketches where he was crossing things out and trying something again. You could actually sort of see it around, and also the turnaround period for the ZX Spectrum was really only 7 months. It was not given a huge amount of time. The date was set of when it was going to be released, and Rick was still doing designs right up until November 1981. It was quite fascinating to see how quickly it all came together. What are we covering next?
I think the thing I found quite interesting about Phil was he was obviously coming at it from the design angle, and I didn't quite realise how much goes into the design of the product. I just never think about it. So it was fascinating, wasn't it, just listening to him going through it. So most of his interview is just breaking down how they come to the design of a product, but I found that really interesting. And you've got Crispin, and that would be quite nice to do Crispin.
Crispin Sinclair is Clive Sinclair's son, and what we found interesting when we interviewed him was that his dad was going to America, going to Hong Kong quite regularly. I don't know if you know this, but Hong Kong is generally a test area for gadgets and strange, weird and wonderful products. It has been for quite some time. And so Clive, when he was still just Clive Sinclair in the 70s, was taking trips to Hong Kong, trips to the States, looking at what other products were doing. And we discovered from Nigel Searle, the MD of Sinclair, that Clive loved Apple. He absolutely, he loved the whole look of Apple products. He used to talk to Steve Jobs, and that was actually quite a key part. And he came back one year with a TRS-80 and gave the TRS-80 to Crispin, who became obsessed with it, loved it, started to learn to program. And Crispin said to us that he actually thinks that his dad kept saying to him, "Oh, you're still interested in programming." And Crispin said, "I can't really ever prove this, but I have a feeling that Dad would notice how entranced I was by the computer and by my interest in programming, because there wasn't really many games that Crispin had for the TRS-80. And what would happen is his dad would, when eventually the ZX80 was created, he brought it in and gave it to Crispin, and Crispin didn't really use it. He sort of plugged it in, had a look at it, but still went back to the TRS-80. The same happened with the ZX81, but when he brought the Spectrum into him, that's where it all changed. And then he actually stopped programming and then started playing games. He became very, very into games. Here's a little clip of Sir Clive's son Crispin talking about when he first got the ZX Spectrum, his views on his dad and the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, I remember getting the ZX Spectrum, and you could see instantly that was going to be a hit. I had the TRS-80, as I say before, so sort of in a way the ZX-80, for me personally, was a little bit disappointing because I'd already had a TRS-80. The ZX-81 was definitely a good computer, but not maybe that much better than the TRS-80. And then when the Spectrum came, you open the box and you think, that's it. It's got colour, proper sound, proper computer, 16K of RAM. That was a real computer. You could see that was going to be huge. That was a lovely machine to have. It had its own look, and it looked like a proper thing, and it had the colour on the case, so you knew what was coming when you sort of plugged it in. And all the keys with all the commands on each key had half a dozen different commands, and it looked like $1 million, a proper thing. Exciting. I think the ZX Spectrum price was probably its absolute key point. I mean, there'd been other computers before that were colour or had sound, but always out of the reach of ordinary average family. Spectrum was the very first that it's still an expensive present, but a lot of people could get for a special Christmas or birthday present, and that was really the key to the whole thing. It was years earlier you could have had a computer would have been thousands of pounds, or probably 5-10 grand in today's money. The Spectrum was the one that millions of people could afford. That's what started really, I think, the birth of the home computer. You could have a real proper, seriously proper computer at home.
Now, one of the things, I know its price keeps coming up with these things, but what is also particularly interesting was we looked at how that price point could be brought down, and one of them was the creation of the Z80 chip, the microprocessor, which was cheap. And that was the thing. When you had microprocessors prior to that, we were still very much in the early days of microprocessors by the mid-70s when the Z80 chip became available. But Federico Fagan, the creator of Zilog, the co-founder of Zilog and the Z80, we couldn't believe it. We wrote to him, and he wrote back, and he said he was very happy to talk about the creation of the Z80. And while we were talking to him, obviously he created the world's first microprocessor as well prior to that. So we covered his entire career. He was a fantastic guy. And what fascinated us about the Z80 was that he actually created it with the intention of it being used all over, whether it be in a coffee maker or whether it be in a computer. The idea was to create a cheap microprocessor that could be used, could be sold, and then it would come down to the inventors as to what they could do with it. So it was a case of, and that's one of the things we've discovered with computer technology over the years, is sometimes you get a situation where engineers do their very best to create this fantastic thing, and then it's up to the others to then create applications for it, or add-ons, or whatever it might be. So here is the creator of the Z80, also the creator of the world's first microprocessor, Federico Fagan. So there we go.
The Z80 was so general purpose that it was used in thousands and thousands of different applications. I mean, the ZX80 was in those days one of already thousands of different applications. So for us, the Z80 was used in high volume in the first chess game players. In 1980, when the ZX80 came out, the highest volume application was a chess game that spoke to you. 183 enter. Rook 27. The computer voice. It was kind of fun. And they were making, hundreds of thousands of those a quarter. In those days, those were high volume applications. Today, you laugh because, with cell phones that you make millions a day, but in those days, those were really high volume applications. 1,000 chip for one application a month. That was a large application for microprocessors in those days.
I always wanted one of them chess sets. I never got one.
Anyone have one of those chess sets?
I thought they looked amazing.
Speaking
I
of,
think it's because it could talk, yeah, but I've never got it.
I'm so hamstrung on my eyes being so blurred. Okay, there we well, we've got, I've just got to double check the time as well, because obviously they asked us to, what were you doing? 4:30 still. Why don't we do some questions on the Spectrum, because we're going to talk a little bit about the Amiga as well soon. So perhaps we just field any questions you might have about the Spectrum, and then we might play another clip. If one of them's relevant. So, anyone have a question?
When you interviewed Federico, was he aware of the ZX Spectrum and the impact it had on the games industry?
I'll just repeat that if I may. So, you were just asking, when we interviewed Federico, was he aware of the significance of the ZX Spectrum and what it had done? The answer to that is yes. But I think he did want to sort of say that was kind of the idea of the creation of Z80 in the first place, was, as we were saying, to make something and say, right, there you go, that's a cheap microprocessor, see what you can do with it, and engineers would obviously make use of it for other applications. But yes, he did have a reasonable knowledge on it, and that's why he was happy to talk to us. But it was quite amazing to interview him, knowing like what he'd been through working with Intel and all these amazing stories, which we did get. But obviously there'll be a limited amount of him in terms of how we use him in the ZX Spectrum film. But he did know. I will say one thing. I'm not saying that other people are not intelligent, but sometimes when you're speaking to somebody that's sort of, they're very aware. And I'll tell you what's very interesting about Federico is in 1989, he obviously pioneered touchscreen technology as well. So as well as inventing the microprocessor and other microprocessors as well, and the Z80, founding Zilog, he then went on to found a company that patented touchscreen technology and voice activation technology. So he's quite a brain box. But in 1989, he came up with the idea of trying to create an AI that could simulate human consciousness. And he spent 2 years doing this and then discovered or realised that would be impossible. And he's now spent the last 30 years of his life trying to measure consciousness as a real thing and track where it comes from. He's literally turned his back on technology completely, and he's very, very soon to announce this new project and book and all this other stuff. We did cover that, but there's no way we could put that in. It's so off topic. But it was like an eye opener, because you had a guy that effectively was very technology based, and he then realised that not for religious reasons, but he then believed that consciousness is measurable and could be tracked from where it came from. So let's see what he comes up with.
So footage like that's actually very important, historically to capture, but not relevant to the film. Would you consider putting that on archive.org or somewhere like that, so more people can have access to it?
I totally agree with you on making footage available, and that would take us on to the Amiga project that we're doing in a minute. I think
We do have hours and hours of footage, and a lot of the people we interview, it does go off in various directions, because obviously they're not all within the games industry and they're doing lots of different things. So we do want to get it all out there in some way, so people can access it, because it's just, I mean, how many hours, we did calculate, I think we're up to about 800 hours. If it would be more now because of what we're doing with Spectrum.
Oh, we were talking about your T-shirt, Malcolm Evans. We interviewed him in Bath, 8-9 years ago. As well as the ZX81, we covered like, the game itself and All's Trashman, everything in his career. I think the interview lasted 3 hours. And often we'll come away, a lot of interviews will go between an hour and a half to 3 hours. Eric Chang for Another World, I think it was 5.5 hours. We were so drained by the end of it that it was because when somebody wants to talk and they've got so much to say, and he was getting props and all sorts of other things out, you don't want to say, well, I'm not interested now. You kind of work with them to get that sort of enthusiasm. So, in fact, you asked the question earlier. If you like, I'll answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it's universal regardless of the subject, but how do you make sure that you get the subject relaxed? And subsequent to that, the follow-on is, how do you make sure that they know what audience they're addressing?
I don't think we ever worry about what audience they're addressing. I think when you're doing an interview, it's a personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you try to, and also I think we all start with childhood questions because it's hard to be corporate-y when you're talking about your past, your childhood, you know, and that was one of the things we always used to do with publishers. When you interview publishers, they've got that sort of corporate banter, so they've got those static answers that they're used to sort of reading out. But it's difficult to be like that when you say, what was the first computer you ever saw, or what was the first game you ever played? They have to sort of go into that area of the brain that sort of fires off nostalgia, and then often that's how you can guide them out of that sort of trap. But I know what you mean, because I've had it where people have sat down.
Well, there's some people that we've interviewed that have never been interviewed before.
No.
So what we'll do is like a pre-interview. So just have a phone call with them, have a little chat about things, talk about what they're happy to talk about, what they're not happy to talk about. And very often with some of them, it's been, I didn't even know I'd done that. You know, it's like they've forgotten about things that they've done, or they've forgotten about the impact of that particular game on someone. And there's some really nice stories that we find that we say to them about, and then they're quite happy to talk about it. So it's all about trying to relax them. Obviously, there's some people that we've interviewed that are up on stage talking in front of thousands of people, and they're quite happy. They'll sit there and know exactly what they're going to say and do. But I think a lot of the From Bedrooms to Billions interviews, a lot of them haven't really been interviewed, have they? So we would get 3 to 4 hours sitting with them, talking about, sometimes it got quite emotional. It was lovely, it was really nice, and I mean, sadly, some of the people that we've interviewed have now passed away. So we think, you know, we do not want that just sitting on our computers and never being seen. So we do want to get that out there. But we want it out there in the way that we edit everything. We don't just want to put stuff out there and it's not edited up properly and everything. We want it to look nice, sound nice. Be to the standard of our films, you know. So.
And also I think I've had this off for ages, sorry. And creating content, I think that people want to see, and there's, you know, rather than just chucking out a raw interview. Not that that's necessarily wrong for some people, but we sort of look at it and think, well, if we can use that sequence with, like now we've got the 3 films done, there's a lot of topics, there's people that we interviewed, say for the PlayStation Revolution, that might be talking about the Spectrum, or might be talking about, so some of them might appear in, and that then means you get a more diverse cast.
Sorry, what are the films that you've done?
We did, the first one was From Bedrooms to Billions, in 2014 that came out, and then we did a film called The Amiga Years, which came out in 2016, and the PlayStation Revolution came out in 2020, though it was finished a bit earlier than that, but it was a bit of a crazy time, 2020. But yeah, so obviously the first film we realised that there was a sort of an untold story about the 16-bit era, so we then went in and did the Amiga. However, we're now coming back to do more on the Amiga because we've been almost continually pestered for 6 years about the A500, because the A500 was a sort of blink and you'll miss it.
Are you doing a Spectrum film now?
I beg your pardon?
Are you doing a Spectrum film?
Yeah, a Spectrum film, we're almost finished filming now, and we started that in January, but proper filming started in February, and we've got another month's filming on that, and that should be all done by the end of July. and then that film is coming out for Christmas this year. We've been editing it while we've been filming it, actually. And we're now doing, in fact, I'll put the...
I think, like Anthony said, with all of our films are around 2.5 hours long, so they are very long. The Rubber Key Wonder, we're aiming for that to be a little bit shorter, and then to have little featurettes to go with it. But I think the main reason we want to go back to things is in our films, we've got to a certain point where we just can't go into the detail that we'd like to. So that's why we're now doing the A500, because we just couldn't cover it all in the original Amiga years. And there's plenty of little avenues that we'd like to explore more of, and that's why we came up with the idea of the Gaming Chronicles, because we thought that would be nice episodic content with lots of little featurettes, which would be from the developers or just little stories.
See, not everything will stand up as a self-contained film. So like we know that the Commodore 64 will be a film. So when we eventually launch that, that'll be a movie as we would
have
have done.
A poster done for that, don't
Yes,
we?
but we haven't shown it yet.
No.
I'm not showing it today either. But this particular project, the Gaming Chronicles, we'd already thought, well, we can explore things like on the evolution of sound, of music, the evolution of graphics, coding, all sorts of different things. But we were getting a lot of emails, especially last year, just saying, because in the Amiga years film, the narrative of the film stops once the A1000 comes out. We have a little bit on the A500, but then the film switches, and then we hear from the developers as to what they were all uniquely able to do differently with the Amiga. Some was obviously audio, some was like Dave Jones tells a story about the hardware mouse on the Amiga was a big deal, rather than a simulated, rather than emulation. Everyone had a different thing, but we then tell that part of the story all the way to the end. But we kind of left the A500. It was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. But with the 35th anniversary of the A500 this year, we've had quite a few people write to us just over the last year or so. Just, you can do anything on the A500. So we kind of looked at this year. The Mini came out. And we then had people. We then did a test on one of our Kickstarters. We just said, what sort of interest is there for us to revisit the Amiga, all the rushes from the Amiga years, and do something on the A500? And we got a really strong response. So we decided to launch this, and we've currently got a Kickstarter up at the moment, which funded last night, actually, in the middle of the night.
We are looking to do more interviews with this project as well. Jeff Porter, we've got on board.
Jack Hager. So the idea of this particular episode is going to focus on where what happened to the remainder of what happened to the A1000 team once they started working on a project called Ranger. Meanwhile, on the other side of America, you had something known as the Rock Lobster project, which was didn't happen immediately, but it was to sort of take the components of the A1000 and get it into a sort of a more Commodore type package that people were used to with the 128 and the Commodore 64, and then be able to sell it in Toys R Us, whereas the A1000 was not something you needed it to be in a computer shop. One of the funny things about the A1000 that we discovered making it was half the problem was people didn't know how to boot it up. So it would be delivered to a gaming shop, and it required someone who knew what they were doing to show it to somebody else, whereas with the Commodore 64 in a box on a shelf with games on it or whatever it might be, it was a much more easy purchase for somebody to make. So that's what we're looking at with this particular project, is the continuation of what happened to the A1000 team and how the Commodore Amiga 500 came about, and we're going to get some more game developers in there as well. So it should be a lot of fun. And when we were going through our rushes, because we wanted to make sure that we're showing only unseen stuff, so it's not like sort of retreading the same stuff, we realised we had a lot of material. So we've actually got a clip from it, which we can just quickly show you, of Dave Haney. If you can see, here we are. This is just a little promo clip we've got.
Why do the A500? I think the big idea there was to make something that Commodore understood better. Commodore was never that good at selling higher end systems, and the A500 sort of hit the same exact market spot that the C128 had. It was something that a Commodore fan recognized. It was kind of what people thought about home computers, at least in the 80s, as this all-in-one thing that fit on your desk. and it was a big cost reduction. The A1000 case was very expensive. All those separate chips that got not eliminated but dramatically reduced with the Fat Agnes reduced the cost of it. It was really just, let's deliver the same level of technology, but mechanically, electronically, whatever we can, cut the cost so that we can make something that Commodore people know what to do. We were a consumer company selling game computers, and it doesn't mean that shouldn't be the only thing Commodore was, but that everyone knew that's what our strength was. A1000 to A500, it's effectively the same machine. I mean, we had a thing called the Vidiot, a video hybrid that is used to take the digital data and turn it into analog, which reduced just a lot of stuff on the board. And that was something George Robbins came up with, and he was a real good designer of like just little things that, how can that work? Well, it did, it worked very well. And the keyboard was built in, so you didn't have to have a separate keyboard case. I mean, it was really the same level of performance, more memory. They had tragically moved the expansion port to the other side of the unit, so all the things that fit on this side of the A1000 had to go over here for the A500, which was a little bit foolish. But that was just the prejudice of having the floppy drive were right here. I'm sure there were plenty of people from Los Gatos who loved the A1000 and hated the A500, but I understand the rationale behind both of them. And I think at the time they were both the right decisions to be made. They were just different decisions, and certainly you can't really fault Commodore for making the A500. It did pretty well.
Yeah, so that's actually a Kickstarter that's running now. So if anybody wants to come on board, please do support us, because we want to try and get a little bit more filming done out in the States, and also do some, we're going to produce a lot more game making of. When we made the original film, we've got so much, we've said the same line obviously earlier before, but we've got so much material left over that we've decided to come up with this idea of basically like a monthly backer pack, where almost like a sort of a monthly fix of Amiga material. So we're going to just focus on up until the lead up to that episode. It'll just be game making offs each month. We love doing those. They're always a really nice thing to do, and we've got all that material, so we thought we'd make use of it. Anyone have any questions with us about that Amiga project or anything?
I've got a question, but it's not about Amiga. I know you've got lots of ideas for new stuff and everything. Would you ever consider doing a film about the history of arcade gaming?
About arcade gaming?
Yeah, sort of arcade coin-op type stuff.
I would love to, yeah, I really would. I love the arcades.
Yeah.
So, yes, definitely. That's something that we would like to do.
I really would like to see that, but
Yeah.
obviously, it could be quite niche, but maybe not.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. But I think as well, because a lot of people were inspired to copy games in the arcades when they were doing the Spectrum games. So yeah, there's definitely a link there. I'd love to, I really would. And we've done quite a lot of work over the years with Amiga
sort of flirting with it just a little bit, but
a full film.
2 hour documentary would be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. We were thinking about it a couple of years ago, but there did seem to be a lot of other films sort of covering that at the time. But
I think your take on it would be superb, because everything you've done has been brilliant.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's right now. I think at
you
the time.
would do it right.
Yeah, because we were looking. It was one of our original ideas, and I think.
Donald Bushnell wrote to us, didn't he?
What was the film? There was another film. I can't remember. When we first set up our Kickstarter from Bedrooms to Billions, we were looking all around Kickstarter, and we saw a film that was being made about the arcades.
Yeah.
And we
there have been some. They've been okay,
But yeah, I would definitely like to do that. So that will come. Yeah.
Well, the majority of the people involved are still alive. I know that's the horrible thing that you have to sort of think about, isn't it? But when you shoot, when you're filming,
do have to think about.
Yeah, it's I think the thing is, it's when we made that first film, we never expected to sort of then be doing 10 years on it, but we really enjoyed making that first film. It it was very organic. It kind of, we did some more. I think we originally said we'd do 20 interviews, and then it was 40, and then it was 60. I think in the end there was 112 interviews from Bedroom Civilians. It was quite crazy. You wouldn't.
It was an editor's nightmare.
Yeah, yeah.
There was so much to go through. I mean, I'm so pleased we have it, but trying to make sure we get everyone in the film, I think that's why it ended up being 2.5 hours.
And the whole way that we approached from Bedroom Civilians was the opposite of the way you should actually do stuff. Because we've been doing a lot of stuff like BBC4 stuff and stuff for the music industry prior to From Bedroom Civilians, and we were sort of able to turn around sort of 6 projects a year, 45 minutes, just 8, 9 interviews, 10 interviews. We've done stuff on Doctor Who and other science fiction, Tom Baker, all sorts of things that were great fun. But turning them around quickly, whereas From Bedroom Civilians, perhaps I don't know, maybe it was because it was a very personal thing for us. We just couldn't stop. It was like, oh, we must have him. And even when we're doing this film now, like Clive Townsend, finally, we're going to, we wanted to interview him 10 years ago, and now finally we are. Sandy White was one of the first ever interviews we ever did, but it was for a different project, so it was actually filmed by a crew that didn't sort of take it seriously, so that we asked them to do it, we sent them to an event to film him, and it didn't quite come out right, so we couldn't use it in For Bedroom Civilians. So Sandy's preparing an amazing thing. He's got his original, I don't know if you're aware, Sandy White created a game called Ant Attack. Yeah. And what happened is his mum and dad's house, they've still kept his bedroom the same. And he kind of didn't realise that nothing's been thrown away. So he's actually recreating his Ant Attack development setup. He's even got the same bed, everything where he built Ant Attack. And we're going up to film him in a couple of weeks in Edinburgh. For this, should be quite interesting. But he's also a Sinclair fanatic, so he won't mind me saying it like that. So he's got all the Micromatic, loads and loads of original Sinclair stuff, and he's also going to assemble a ZX80 he's got a 4K overhead camera, and he's going to assemble it in real time. So we can sort of show that there was a period of time when people were quite happy to assemble their own computers and build them. I don't know if you know about the Black Watch, the Sinclair Black Watch. It's quite a famous story about. You go to turn the television over and the watch suddenly says 8888.
Think hardly
nothing.
But the batteries just lasted days. So it was the battery.
The funny thing is, what people don't quite realise about that is the Sinclair watch was actually a success. It was regarded as a failure. Do you know what they did? Yeah. They actually, the kit community in America was so massive that they took out an ad in the 2 main electronics magazines, and they sold all of them. Because they realised that once they worked out that they didn't have static shielding in the watch, so you went to turn the TV over or touched your jumper, and then your watch went blank, and it was dead. So they realised they needed to put a static sheet into the watch, and they realised on the production line it was a nightmare to fit it into the case. So they went, stop, we'll give it to the kit community because they'll work it out. And what amazed me was they sold all the remaining stock, hundreds of thousands of units, and he said we allowed for like 12% comebacks. He said that nothing, not a single watch was sent back. He said that we couldn't believe it. We managed to but they did technically work with the shielding, but it was left to the hobbyist to work out how to insert them. Sorry, massively off topic there, but there's those little stories we're always looking for. Those tiny, silly little things about, like in the Amiga years when Dave Needle told us about the plans to Atari, that they had a pact where they decided they weren't going to ever reveal that they gave Atari doctored plans for the Amiga's chips, and Dave decided on the spot, I've changed my mind, I'm going to tell you, and we put it in the film. But I don't think that people really cared in the end. So much time had passed, but it would have been obviously a disaster had that info come out in the mid-1980s. Any other questions, anybody? Computers, games, developers?
Spectrum or Amiga?
Whatever you like.
I mean, I back both of your projects today after
the
current one and the late one. I see you can still pre-order it.
Yeah.
So
that's right, thank you very much.
I am always fascinated by the fact how Spectrum didn't just ignite a revolution here in the UK and elsewhere, but especially so in Eastern Europe. There are, in every Russian oblast or region, there were clones. In Poland, there was a company who reverse engineered the ULA and replaced it with simple logic components. And there's so many clone makers there around, and people who grew up just like here, educating themselves and started to program. I think you would be semi-gods if you in that huge region, if you recognized and celebrated that culture. Maybe you already are. I apologize.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because actually that was a massive omission from this talk. Apologies everybody. As Indiana Jones once said, I'm making this up as I go, so it's kind of, but that's absolutely correct. What we discovered when we started that Kickstarter last October, you attract people to you, obviously, backers, but you also get people with interesting stories, anecdotes, that sort. That's one of the reasons we love doing them, because you never know who you're going to meet. And that's absolutely correct. We assumed that the ZX Spectrum, a little bit of Timex, a little bit of selling in the US, a little bit of, but when we actually started looking at the numbers, now this is the controversial element. I know this video will go out, so we have to be sure of this before we put it in the film. But the Commodore 64 is considered the world's largest selling single computer of all time. I think it might be replaced by the Spectrum. So, I mean, and not just knocking it slightly off, massively knocking it off, because we're dealing with millions and millions and millions of units. Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, Portugal, Spain, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, massive followings. And so that's why we had to start adding subtitles on to different, because we were thinking, like, you get the Polish guys saying, you know, we'll back it, but we need to know, and then we didn't know, and that's one of the things. People would assume that we've got this huge knowledge all the time, but when you go into something, you're ready to learn. You should be, when you're making a documentary, you've got to throw those preconceived ideas, even though you do have them, you can't. But you have to be prepared to be surprised all the time and be continually trying to learn more information so you can get those little anecdotes. But that's absolutely correct.
Well, we've actually started covering the clones, haven't we? We filmed, we actually did remote filming with it's an exhibition in Portugal, isn't it? The Load Museum in Portugal, and they've got pretty much all the clones there. So we've been filming them this week. I can't believe how many there are.
Yeah,
so many different ones.
They've got nearly all of them, not all of them, but nearly all of them, and it took 3 hours to film just those. You know, the Load Museum in Portugal. João is a fantastic guy, and they did a really good. We actually were able to help them get Steve Vickers on their on the actual anniversary day back in April. We were really pleased to sort of join them together to give them a little bit, because they had Crispin Sinclair appearing and also Grant Sinclair. Both of those guys, Sinclair relatives, are in our film. Both of them are inventors as well, Grant and Crispin. So you've got a question?
No, I'll just stretch my arm.
Did people not play the Commodore 64 then?
That is a good question. In fact, I asked that question at the Load Museum the other day, and he said there were some, but nowhere near the Spectrum. The Spectrum was a lot easier to clone. It was, largely off-the-shelf component. There was some reverse engineering required in certain areas, but it just seemed to be, perhaps maybe because of the low cost or the number of off-the-shelf components existed.
Well, wasn't there also an influence of the Cold War that the American chips would be sold to Russia, but they could get clones of the Z80, so they could make Z80 machines a lot easier than 6502s.
That is correct. That is also correct. And the other thing, it was even going on with the ZX81 prior to that. I mean, we interviewed Henry Caulfield, the one of the ZX Spectrum Next team, and obviously he grew up in Brazil with his own clone. I think it was the MK85. Was it the Night? And it looks exactly the same as the Spectrum, but his ZX81 clone had rubber keys, which was fascinating because but they had come out the year after, so he got it the year after the Spectrum came out, but the ZX81 that looked more like a Spectrum with rubber keys. But it came with, that's another thing that we noticed, that when these clones appeared, they'd often evolve them, add 16K RAM built in or things like that.
It wasn't just clones, because Timex released a version of the ZX81 in a grey case in the States.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, so they could have then gone, oh, this is basically what they're doing, although half of it's a Spectrum and half of it's a ZX81. They would just clone whatever they could get their hands on.
That's right. I think that when we went into the project, I'll be honest with you, our knowledge on the clones was like that. Now it's a lot bigger, but still continually growing. We're continually being surprised, and we realised we had to.
How many there are?
Yeah.
Because when we were doing the Kickstarter, people were writing to us and started telling us about the clones. Oh, it's really interesting. And then it was just like, oh my god, they were everywhere. Just I had no idea.
So Sinclair obviously didn't make any money off the clones.
What was Clive's dad was the gentleman tasked with distributing the Spectrum and ZX81 around the world, and he kind of got replaced by a guy called Charles, who when he came in, he realised that it was the ship had sailed, that the damage had been done in terms of. Don't forget, countries like Brazil also had no copyright law. So it wasn't actually illegal to rip something off. Is that a question, or are you stretching your arm again?
In Brazil, there's actually a Spectrum clone that was sold in a Commodore Plus 4 case. So
really?
Commodore Plus 4, I think it's Commodore Plus 4 case, Commodore Plus 4 keyboard, there's a Spectrum clone. Because it was a company that had done the official Commodore 64 version.
You're right. We filmed it the other day because I actually remember saying to Joel, it looks like a Plus 4. So he had one. There's even ones with different colour, completely weird coloured cases as well. And
I think when they did that, Commodore sabotage it.
I wonder why. Yeah.
So it's I believe the going back to the Spectrum might be, I think because the original thing was it's the single model from the same manufacturer, so the clones would count. But it's believed that it's now the iPhone. Technically, the Commodore 64 isn't the greatest selling computer because it's now the iPhone.
Yeah.
iPhone, I can't remember what model it was, but they got to a point where it was like an iPhone, maybe 5, where it outsold the Commodore 64, and it's like, this computer, got a phone in it, it's still a computer. So
yeah, I know. It does technically tick the box as a single computer, doesn't it? Even though unfortunately it's a phone. But I think it would be quite interesting if we can. With this clone story, we're still in the process of properly telling. I mean, we continue to being surprised, but I think the short answer is it's vast.
Yeah.
And I don't think even Sinclair really knew. And when we were talking to Nigel Searle, he was surprised. And Charles, I keep thinking, what's Charles' surname? Sorry about that.
Cotton.
Charles Cotton. So when we interviewed him, he Googled the clones the night before, because we put in his questions, a load of questions about the clones. And he was shocked. He was open-mouthed about it. He didn't know. He went to Wikipedia and he saw that list that's there, and then had a little check, and he couldn't believe it. And he said, I didn't even know it was this bad. Because obviously he'd left Sinclair long ago and sort of kind of forgotten about it. But yeah, it's I think it's probably got to be somewhere in the region of between 30 and 50 million.
Did they clone the later models of the Spectrum as well? I think 128 and
Yeah, by about 1985, once Amstrad, or 86, once Amstrad took control, that stopped. Alan Sugar pretty much
stopped the clones.
Yeah, he really made sure. Maybe, I mean, this is a complete guess, but maybe with Jack Trammell having a similar attitude towards being ripped off, maybe that's another reason. But I think it's probably more hardware. I think it just comes down to reverse engineering. We can make this much easier than we can to replicate a Spectrum, a Commodore. So that might have, but again, maybe Clive was regarded, Sinclair weren't looked on. Though they were linked with Timex, so Timex had a fairly big fist, so maybe you wouldn't want to take them on. But we've even discovered stuff which could potentially show that Timex were doing some, and we have to be sure about this, but might have been doing some little deals on the side and bypassing Sinclair. We've heard all sorts of different stories, but you get that when you're doing interviews, because people will sometimes guess and stuff, and you've got to check to sort of check those facts out. Stretch your question.
Well, actually, I think the reason why there were spectrums comes down to cloning the VIC-2 and the SID was different. Because Commodore themselves struggled to make VIC-2 chips in the first few years. They had the yield was ridiculously low. But back then, there was no copyright on the masks. So
Really?
yeah, literally until about, I think it was about 84, because the NES actually has a 6502 clone in it, and how they avoided the license fees is there were a few patents, and one of them was on the decimal mode, so they basically just cut the lines on about 4 bits to disable it, and then it was perfect fine, it was legal. With the Z80, rather than patents, they put in traps so that when you actually decapped it, there's stuff that you can make look like, I don't know too much about chips, but like something about depletion mode, or all this kind of stuff where you can make it look as if there's supposed to be a connection when there isn't. And they'd list it with all of those. And if you copied it wrong, it didn't work. So you had to work out what the bits were. And once they'd done that, you couldn't stop them. You couldn't stop them selling. So that's how the Z80 was cloned in Russia, because there was no legal way of stopping them.
Interesting.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's what we like about when we're in the middle of a film. It's sort of like you're always continually learning stuff. So it's that's why I suppose we've been doing this for 10 years now. We sort of really enjoy. We sort of little things that we sort of think might be interesting to us. They do seem to be interesting to other people. So hopefully people keep watching. We'll keep making really, and that's kind of what the Gaming Chronicles is. It's the sort of thing we can do in between the films. So like, there's all sorts of ideas we've got for that, and it just seemed fitting with the A500 first for this year, because A500 wouldn't have made a film. There's not enough what we call meat on the bone for that, but there was enough featurettes and other things that we could come up with, and there was a lot of interesting stuff that arose when we were making the Amiga year. Sorry, we've switched. I've gone from Spectrum to
switching.
Yeah, switch all over the place. Any more questions, by the way?
Yeah, it's a fairly obvious one, and sort of related to the arcade questions, a great point. I would focus on manufacturers if that helps, Wii U's and stuff like that. However, would you consider any other platforms or formats? Would you look at the Atari? Because the Atari 80s are fascinating in themselves. Or the ST, because it had its day and it has time. And also maybe, of course, there's the abstract Amiga, on which I'm but just, are you considering, I know you're doing amazing work as it is and really appreciated, but are you looking at other platforms and looking at them and their impact, what they did? Yes, you're doing the C64, which is really valuable, but there are other things to look at. I mean, you could also argue, how important PlayStation 2 was, believing it really was, and that kind of stuff. If you look into those, I know you could go on for decades, but you can't.
I think we do.
Yeah.
We do want to.
We did cover
the Atari story.
Well, that PS2, for example, there's a classic example in theory. I don't think it'll be an early one. We could do a Gaming Chronicles on the PS2, because we did cover the PS2 to a certain degree in the PlayStation revolution, but we've got so much more. It's a typical thing, so we know we could, in theory, do something on the PS2, even the PS3, which is a story in its own right. I don't know if I'd want to tell that particularly anytime soon, but we've got a 55-minute edit on the Amstrad CPC left over from Bedrooms to Billions. We've got something on the BBC. I've been in touch with Steve Ferber for years about finally looking to do something on the BBC Micro. There's all sorts of with Mega Drive comes up quite a lot. People bring up the Mega Drive with us quite a bit. We have actually asked Sega about that. We're still waiting to know what else have we got. We've already interviewed a lot of the people that created the VCS, so we could do we could always do something on the Atari 2600.
I think
a lot of them came from the Amiga.
Do absolutely everything. And I think that's why the Gaming Chronicles works quite nicely for us. So yes, I mean, we just need to replicate ourselves.
Yeah.
Just to be able to do more.
So I take it those would be done as maybe a shorter, like you've done with the Amiga one there, short little, maybe half hour.
Yes.
Speak about the ST, about Atari 8-bits, about whatever, you know. that sort of-
There's
not enough like a whole film, but there's an interesting story there. You know?
I'll tell you what, if you look at From Bedrooms to Billions, which focused on the British games industry, there's huge sections, massive sections from that film. We had a 9-hour timeline for a while. Like even, I've mentioned this before, so I apologise if you've heard this before, but even on the evolution, it sounds really boring, but it isn't, well at least I don't think it is, on how we got to do tape duplication in this country, about all the early companies that were trying to, once they got to the point where they had to mass produce cassettes, there wasn't a company in the UK that could meet the audio quality required to mass produce them. It was even companies that were producing cassettes for music. When the tests were done, the audio quality wasn't good enough for computer code to come through. How did that change? Well, we got that information. We've got a whole sequence on. There were broadcasts going on, radio broadcasts for early Spectrum and ZX81 games.
Even television did it.
That's right.
Television did it.
So even in the way that those the way that we get our software and the way that we get it into the computer to run it, even that had to go through an evolution process. So that's where I came up with the Gaming Chronicles. We thought, even though some of it might be hardware based, but the word gaming might not match. But
also the magazines, journalism, there's so many angles. We have got a very long list.
We've been nagging Chris Wilkins about doing because we've got all the interviews, a Newsfield documentary to cover but not just Newsfield, but the evolution of the magazines themselves. So many of us read them because that was our fix. It was our way of feeling like we were part of a community. And when I used to say pre-internet, you'd always get some very friendly geek off to the side saying, well, there was technically an internet available at the time, but you know what I mean, a massive geek.
It's pretty well right away.
It was in, there was technically something in the 60s and the 70s, but which is another story, but you know.
Just very quickly, would you ever consider doing maybe a short one on like Frank Freaky, that sort of stuff, you know, the hacker community of the early 70s, you know, the blue boxing, stuff like that?
I mean, anything's possible. I mean, Federico Fagin opened our eyes to another potential story, the whole Silicon Valley side of it, but that's not really gaming so much, but my word, did he tell us stuff which was like, oh my God, you know, some of the stuff that was going, there was a whole, when we interviewed Chuck Peddle once, that's for a different project, he was telling us about the shenanigans that were going on, and the threats to, you are not going to create a microprocessor under $25, you are not going to do that, you know, because they wanted to keep them over $300, but he and Federico knew if you get the price down, you'll never get home computers. And not just home computers, you won't get, well, we'd used it like a teas made or chess set, whatever it might be. And that's what we grew up with in the 80s. We saw the benefits of those cheap microprocessors during the 1980s because of those innovations in the 70s.
I mean, how is he going to get Doom on a fridge? Does it run Doom?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We should play that,
Yeah.
Have you thought about doing something about the Comics multi-system?
Yes. We've got the material for it, and we are. I mean, there's a lot of subject, like we're interviewing Martin Brennan soon. So there's all sorts of other aspects, other peripherals.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say you've got because that was the Flare guys that did that.
Yeah.
So they started, I think, at Sinclair working on the Loki, I think it was.
That's right.
Which never happened.
Is that something that you've got any information on? Because, you know,
a lot of we're interviewing Martin in a couple of weeks.
It was just, let's just have a wish list, and it was never really a thing. It was just like, we could have that, yeah, but it was never going to be built. It was just never going to be that machine for that amount of money. It was just like, you know.
That turned into they went to work on Panther, some of them worked at Jaguar. I think one of them ended up at Nvidia working on what essentially turned into the switches SoC. I'm not sure if he was still there at the time when that was done, but it's kind of as a UK console. and the people involved in that then going around the world, how influential they were. I think even the Super Effects chip for the SNES was one of them. But,
Interesting. And it's the funny thing is actually, I'm already thinking about the amount of research I've got coming up prior to Martin's interview. So because there's so much to cover. So if you'd asked me that question in a month's time, I could probably sat here and bored you all to death with him. What I will say is because obviously he's very keen to get his Spectrum 128 story out there. Because obviously that's another infamous story, was that it was technically designed and built and ready, and there was a lot of, I suppose you can imagine it, in 1984, Clive's obsession on that point was the QL. He was aware of the Apple Mac, and he was aware of other things that were coming out. The IBM PC, which was an obsession with a lot of companies. It crops up with the Amiga team a lot. This obsession with the IBM PC, but the PCs were getting out there, and offices were buying them. And so the QL was obviously Clive's response to that, but he put all his attention, had that focus, and there were people within Sinclair saying, we need a follow-up to the Spectrum, we need to improve on that design. It was designed in 1981, so they needed that, really that 128 machine should have come out a lot earlier than it was, and Martin wants to get across the fact that if it was designed and done, it could have come out, and Clive wanted the QL, he didn't want anything to get in the way of the QL. Nigel Sell felt that the mistake with the QL that killed it was the microdrives. They said if only we'd waited, we could have put a floppy on it, and that would have done it, because it was a big machine.
They chatted to Sony, didn't they? They had a floppy drive system, but it was just too expensive.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. Lovely.
Again,
That's
trying to
absolutely.
do it down to a price, you know.
Yeah, and the other thing was Clive had no interest in a third-party peripheral on it. He wanted the microdrive technology he wanted to push, and of course Martin Brennan worked on that as well. So I'm looking forward to, and he was telling me how unreliable it was, because you're dealing with tapes that stretch, and people would often get it and say, oh, it's got this amount of data left on it, and then they reset it, and then it would show up with more or less, and he had to continually write code to take into account for the tape stretch. And in the end, he realised it was impossible to be accurate with it. But I'll find out more. I've already done just to answer your question earlier, actually, we always do pre-interviews. So we have a phone call that often goes on almost as long as the interview, so we can make loads of notes. And then when we interview them, we've got a lot more preparation. So that's another thing we do. So I've already done Martin's pre-interview, and that was 2.5 hours. So one of those things where you pull your phone away from and it's like hot at the end of it. But yeah.
You like a nice chat as well.
Yeah.
That was nice, yeah.
Any other questions? We've got 90 seconds.
Did you want to say something?
Oh, this stuff we didn't even introduce her.
Yeah.
Our daughter Jessica here. She is a huge gamer, and she's got terrible hay fever today.
Say hello. Come on. Say hello. Hello.
She's like, thanks for putting me on the spot.
She said to me she wanted to say something. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. There you go. One final question, otherwise we'll say goodbye. I think we'd better wrap up. Thank you so much for sitting.
Thank you very much.